Spare the rod, spoil the child. We've heard this saying for generations. This saying's been around in some way, shape, or form for literally thousands of years. So we're going to talk about this a bit today as part of our parenting and our self-leadership series. We're also going to dive into fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. So let's jump right in. This is QX Parenting Self-Leadership 5. I'm Pastor Scott Conway. This is QX Church. A curious thing about parenting. A lot of parenting is leadership. And in these lessons, we're going to be dealing with parenting and self-leadership. Because for those of us who aren't parents, for those of us today who aren't fathers, today's Father's Day as we are recording this particular lesson, that if you don't have kids to raise, it's very easy to take a look at what the Bible has to say about parenting, what the Bible has to say about taking care of kids, about leading kids, about training kids, about disciplining children, and just sort of tune out because we're not in that season of life. And if you're not a parent, if you're even not married, and so not only do you not even have a parent or not have children to raise, that you don't have a spouse, you don't have children on the way. I mean, it's just so far out of your mind, it's easy to tune out parenting lessons. But if you understand that parenting is leadership, and you understand one of the core leaderships every human being can practice is self-leadership, and you can pull these self-leadership lessons out of these parenting verses, then these verses become enormously powerful passages out of wisdom literature. And what we mean by wisdom literature is when you're teaching theology, when you're teaching this is what the Bible says, this is what the Bible teaches, then you're teaching from the Word of God. You're teaching the lessons of the Bible. But when we talk about the Bible as wisdom literature, it goes beyond the words in the Bible. It's beyond what God is actually teaching us, and it's what additional wisdom can we gain from it. And so if we understand that parenting has a parallel to leadership, and we understand that a key leadership is self-leadership, even though what God is teaching us in His Word is parenting, what else we can learn from His Word is wisdom for self-leadership. Now, this is not the same as this is what God's teaching us. Rather, this is what we can learn from what God's teaching us. So it's in two different categories. So don't confuse wisdom literature, wisdom acquired from Scripture, with the lessons of Scripture. They're in two separate categories. There's overlap, obviously, but if it's not the actual lesson of the Bible, it's different than biblical teaching. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense to everyone. I try to mention this in just about every lesson because I really want us to understand that these are two different categories. You can gain insight and wisdom from wisdom literature that goes beyond what it says. And if you learn how to do this, this is one of the keys to acquiring wisdom in day-to-day life. Taking an individual thing that occurs, distilling out of it a general principle so you can gain wisdom and insight for other areas of your life. Proverbs 13:24 is one of our two verses we'll be talking about today. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. This is where we get the saying, spare the rod, spoil the child. Now, the rod here includes a physical rod. It also just includes a symbol of authority. So one who spares the rod might be sparing the physical rod, if you think of it in terms of corporal punishment. But it's also the rod of authority. So sparing the rod is also not using your authority. The rod also represents command. And so when you're sparing the rod, you're also not exerting command. And so when we talk about spare the rod, when we talk about someone who doesn't use the rod, we're talking about a number of things here. One is someone who doesn't use the physical rod. They don't physically discipline. They don't do anything at a physical level to impose discipline. Now, this can include, now, we're not just talking about beating a child physically, but imagine a child is running off into the street. And someone who's so opposed to using any physical discipline might be opposed to say, well, you don't grab your child, because if you snatch up your child, then that's using physical force. Now, someone might say, well, but that's a safety issue. That's different. Or someone who tells a child, well, go to your room. And the child refuses. Well, some parents might physically pick up the child and carry the child off to the room. And someone who is absolutely, totally opposed to using any level of physical force would say, well, child won't go. What are you going to do? So I told him to go, he won't go. What are you going to do? I mean, you can't physically pick up a child and carry them. I mean, that's using physical force. All that's doing is showing that the bigger, stronger person can put you wherever you want. And you can't do that. And so we're talking about someone who spares the rod at the physical level of someone who won't use physical force, won't use their physical strength, won't use physical discipline, won't use physical controls to get control of someone when it is warranted. And by the way, physical force can include like locking doors, physically restraining someone, anything that limits where they go. I mean, like locking someone in the house would be one example. Locking someone in the car would be another example. Locking someone out of something would be an example. And so this whole idea of, you do something at a physical level that creates a physical control of behavior. The authority part is where you have authority, where you have the right to make the decision. Sparing the rod means someone doesn't make the decision. It's their decision to make. It's in their authority, and perhaps in their responsibility. And they refuse to make those decisions. They refuse to use their authority for discipline. And command, the same thing, is someone who refuses to use their command for discipline. So he who spares the rod, he who doesn't use the physical authority, or doesn't use physical technique, someone who doesn't use their authority, and someone who doesn't use command, someone who doesn't do any of these things, Scripture tells us, hates the son. That if you have a child and your child needs to be physically controlled and you refuse to do so, you hate your son. If you have a child that needs the authority of a parent to make a decision, to make something happen, who needs the command of a parent to tell the child what to do, what is and is not acceptable, and someone refuses to do that, Scripture says that person hates his son. But he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Well, we have discipline and punishment here. Discipline is to control behavior. And so if you understand discipline is to control behavior, when you limit someone's physical ability to go places, you're controlling their behavior. You're saying you can go here and no further. When you limit someone's ability to go into something, to get into something, to get into a cabinet or a storage thing, you limit their physical ability to get to a game system, to whatever it is they physically want to go do, that's exerting discipline. That's controlling their behavior. It's saying, no, you're not allowed in that. No, you're not allowed out of here. And so that's discipline, controlling behavior. Punishment is pay a price. Now, discipline and punishment overlap. You can use punishment as a discipline, but not all punishment is discipline. And you can accomplish discipline with punishment, but not all discipline is punishment. Now, punishment should fit the crime. And we talked about this in the last lesson, about how punishment is a penalty for a behavior. And so if you're going to punish someone, punishment must fit the crime. But discipline should fit the person. The goal of discipline is to control behavior. So what do you have to do to control behavior? So sometimes if you have someone who is, you have a kid who's squirrely and constantly wants to run out in the street, you might need to physically hold on to them pretty much all the time in some way, shape, or form to keep them from sprinting off. Some people might not need that kind of control. Some, you might just say, stay near mommy, and they'll stay near mommy. Some might say, stay where I can see you, and they'll stay where you can see them. So for some, words are enough. For some, you don't even need words. You just look at them, and you point that finger. And you go, I'm sorry. But one of my preferred means of adjusting the behavior of children in my classes is I'll just look at them. And I'll look at whatever needs to be changed. I'll look at their eyes. I'll make eye contact. I'll look at what needs to be changed. And they start to get, they go, wait, looking at me, he's looking at my feet. Oh, I need to move my feet, here. And they'll make the change. Now this is different because they're not in trouble. It's discipline. We're teaching them something. And so we're trying to control their behavior by teaching them to control their own behavior. And so that's part of what you're after with discipline. Disciplining your child is controlling your child's behavior. It can be teaching them, controlling their doing of their homework, their doing of their chores. It doesn't have to be punishment. What will it take to control your child's behavior? Use your authority, use your command, and when necessary, even physical force, even physical restraint, even locking a child, inside the house, whatever it takes to get your child's behavior under control. That's discipline. The goal should be to help your child become self-disciplined. And self-discipline, of course, is then to control your own behavior. The goal of punishment is to attach such a penalty to a behavior that someone won't do that behavior anymore because the price to pay for doing the behavior is too high. But for some people that doesn't work. For some people certain penalties are meaningless. And I've talked about the one particular family that I use as an example because they had two children whose response to certain punishments was so diametrically opposed that when you sent both of the kids to the room, the son would have wailing and gnashing of teeth like you just condemned him to the gulag. And the daughter thought, well, that's a wonderful break. I'm going to go up there and I'm just going to have a good time and I'm going to relax. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to play with my stuffed animals. I'm just going to use my imagination and tell myself a story and have a great and grand time. So for one, it's no penalty at all. And for the other one, it's like condemning him to hell. And so punishment says, well, but that's the prescribed punishment for this behavior. Discipline says, well, that'll work on him. He misbehaves and that'll change his behavior, but that won't change her behavior. She needs something different. She needs a different penalty connected to the punishment in order for her behavior to change. And so while punishment might say the punishment must be the same, discipline says, well, we have to adjust it for her because she's going to like the punishment. So self-discipline is to control your own behavior. And just as this is our target goal for your children, it obviously should be a target goal for ourselves. And likewise, adjusting for ourselves. We can't adjust or have penalties for ourselves that we actually like, because then that's no penalty at all. As parents, self-discipline is a matter of lead by example. We want our children to be disciplined. We demonstrate self-discipline. For all adults, it's just a matter of personal responsibility. Do you take responsibility for what you do? Responsibility is by the way, just do what you're supposed to do without being told. The simple idea is that when we assume responsibility, we don't need someone else to tell us what to do. We already know what to do, and we do it because it is ours to do. Now, this is something that parents demonstrate all the time, but sometimes fail to point out to their child. Like a very simple example is when a child needs to brush their teeth. I know parents that try to get their children to brush their teeth when their kids are little, when their kids are big, when their kids are teenagers, and sometimes even when their kids are adults still living at home. Did you brush your teeth? Go brush your teeth. Let me see your teeth and let me see if you actually did brush your teeth. Did you do a good job? Did you floss? Now, one of the ways that you can help illustrate this to children is when you're doing your responsibilities, point out to your children that you're doing the responsible thing. As simple a thing as, hey, when Dad brushes his teeth, who tells Dad he has to brush his teeth? Oh, nobody. Like, does Grandma have to call up on the phone and tell Dad to brush his teeth? Does Grandma have to show up and check Dad's teeth? No. Why does Dad brush his own teeth? Because that's being responsible. It's a daily responsibility we all know we have to brush our teeth in the morning and in the evening, and I do it without anyone telling me I have to do it. So if you want to show me that you're getting a little bit more grown up in this area of your life, what's something that you can do? And by attaching your grown up to responsibility, because that's one of the defining characteristics of being a grown up, is your being responsible. And as the children learn that, okay, so one of the defining characteristics of me showing I'm growing up, not just getting older, that I'm growing up, is taking responsibility for that which is mine to do. And one of the things that's mine to do when I'm still fairly young is to brush my own teeth without mom or dad having to constantly be on me. And by pointing out some of these very simple responsibilities that we model, that we want our children to copy, we can underscore them by basically following the basic fundamental parenting principle I talk about a lot of be the example, explain the example you're being. And that explain the example you're being part is part of how you draw attention to what you want your children to pay attention to. So not just obedience, do what you're told, brush your teeth because I told you to, but responsibility, do what you're supposed to do without being told, and being the model for that and pointing out the fact that you are the model for that. So we do that because it is ours to do. So still on Proverbs 13:24, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. So promptly here is early, earnestly, diligently. Disciplining someone early means that when you see something going on, you get to it quickly. It's when you see principles in operation. That you don't have to wait for something to actually happen. You can see the principles in operation and try to get control of the principles while they're going on. The idea here is how you do one thing is how you do all things. Like it might not be that big a deal when you see a child procrastinating on one particular thing, where that thing itself might not necessarily be one way or the other, doesn't matter. So it's not something that's a big deal. But if you can get control of the procrastination before it matters, rather than waiting until it matters, that's part of disciplining early. How you do one thing is how you do all things. Disciplining earnestly is to fix something fast. And so rather than just kind of go, well, we're going to get to it early, a little bit here, a little bit there. Yeah, we'll get this procrastination thing under control in 10 or 15 years. Don't worry. No, disciplining earnestly means you get on it, you stay on it, and you get it done fast. The idea here is kill the dragon in the egg, to nip it in the bud. And so you want to cure the problem now. And that's getting to something earnestly. So early is when you see something beginning to unfold. You don't wait until the crisis. You get to it when you see it coming. Earnestly means you want to get to it fast. You want to get to that dragon before it hatches. You want to nip this problem in the bud. And then discipline diligently is to get it done. That you press into it until it's done. Even if the principles just slipped by you, even if you didn't get to it when it was a small issue, if it needs fixing, it needs fixing. Very often, big problems are the result of little problems that weren't handled when they were little problems. And the bigger the problem, the more diligent you have to be. Sometimes you get to a big problem, it just slipped by, you just didn't notice, or maybe it just never really came up. But when it does, there's some big deal going on. And you might not have seen it early to get to it early. You might not have been able to nip it in the bud and get it fixed fast. And by the time you get to it, it's late and there's no fast fix. It's going to take some time. You're going to have to work on it. If the dragon hatched, if the dragon grew up, if the dragon laid eggs, and they grew up, and they gathered an army of monsters to attack, it will take a lot of diligence and firepower to get it done. And sometimes this happens. Now, sometimes it happens because, honestly, there are some parents that are almost willfully blind to the things that their children are doing. But much more common than that are things that you just don't notice. And part of the reason we don't notice is, frankly, our kids don't tell us everything. Not everything comes to the attention of parents. And sometimes by the time it does, there's been something going on behind the scenes that has kind of been metastasizing back there. And by the time we're aware that there's a problem, by the time something gets brought to our attention as the parents, it's a big deal. Now, sometimes this even happens just in our own adult life as individual adults. That there was something that was going on, and maybe it was going to affect us, but we had no idea. But by the time it does affect us, it's a huge deal. A friend of mine was just going through the process of having to hunt down a job before they ran out of money. Now the problem that he had is he'd been through this process recently enough that they haven't restored the savings that served as the financial buffer that allowed him to be unemployed as long as he was unemployed last time. And so as he's hunting now for a new job, their cushion is much, much smaller. He's in a much bigger rush. Now, was this coming down the pipe? Probably. But he didn't know that. Maybe his bosses knew that. Maybe the chief accountants knew that. Maybe the owner of the company knew that. But he didn't know that was coming. By the time it showed up to him, the end of his income was so close, there's nothing he could do about it. So that's what, an example of, by the time it showed up in his life, by the time he knew the problem was there, it's a big problem. It's a big deal. And it's not something that he could have been planning for in advance, because as far as he knew, he had a solid job that he could be at for years. He didn't know that the end was coming. And so sometimes, just in adult life, we have to be where this happens to us. And so we're going to do self-discipline. He who spares the rod to himself hates himself. He who doesn't use whatever you need in order to get yourself under control is showing self-hatred. Sometimes you need to restrain yourself. Sometimes you need to physically declare things off limits. Sometimes you need to engage in physical discipline with you. Sometimes you just need to lock something up. One way, say for instance, that one of the things you're trying to do is control your diet, you might need to physically get rid of stuff out of your house. So make sure that you do not physically have in your home that which you should not be eating. And so sometimes it takes something like that. You have to physically just get rid of it. So it's gone. You don't have to deal with it anymore. Sometimes if you're dealing with, say, individuals, and say you're having a problem with individuals, then you have to just physically stay away from that person. And so you're exerting physical discipline. Sometimes you have to physically do stuff to get yourself under control. Sometimes you have to work out. Sometimes you have to go for a run. Sometimes you have to lift weights. Sometimes you have to go to your martial arts class. You have to utilize your authority over yourself to tell yourself what to do, to make those decisions about your own life, to make your own decisions about how you're going to get stuff done, to make your own decisions about the process you're going to use, to make your own decisions about how you're going to upgrade that process. And that you have to wield your own command. I mean, literally tell yourself what to do. And he who does not use this rod against your own yourself for self-discipline hates yourself. And that you want to be disciplining yourself earnestly, promptly. You get to it fast. Get to it early. That when you begin to notice something, get to that self-discipline early. Very often there's patterns that unfold. We see stuff coming, and we don't do anything about it. We wait until it turns into a crisis. That when you see something coming, it's time to start doing something and get to it early. And then get to it earnestly. If there's a fast fix and a slow fix, if there's something that will just get it handled versus something that will just put it up, just get it handled. That's being earnest. And then being diligent. Stick to it. Keep pressing into it. Keep imposing the solution. Keep upgrading your plan until you get it done. And so he who loves his son disciplines him promptly. He who loves himself self-disciplines promptly. So if you do not use your physical rod, your self-authority, your self-command, you hate yourself. And if you love yourself, you have this good, healthy love, you will discipline, control your own behavior promptly, early, earnestly, and diligently. Moving on to Ephesians 6:4. Ephesians 6:4 reads, "And you fathers," so specifically addressing dads. Now, by the way, the implication here isn't that there are no mothers who do this, but that this tends to be a problem with fathers more often than mothers. And whether that's still true now, well, you could discuss that. But the implication here is that Ephesus, it was true in Ephesus at the time this was being written to them. "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture an admonition of the Lord. So part of the idea here is avoid pushing your children to rebellion. Nurture as God nurtures. Admonish and exhort as God admonishes and exhorts. And we're going to dive into some of this. But one of the things I want to mention at first is one of the fastest ways to get someone to rebel is to not allow them to have their own opinion. So if someone speaks an opinion and you shut them down like they're not allowed to have that opinion, guess what? They still have the opinion. It's just that now you're not going to hear about it. But it's going to still be inside them and metastasizing, and they will be rebelling against you in their hearts and likely looking for an opportunity to rebel in their behavior. Perhaps to rebel secretly, to do things and hide them from you, or perhaps even to rebel openly. So as we dive into this, Ephesians 6:4 has some pretty amazing implications just as a leadership verse. Because here's something to keep in mind. We talked about this last time, the fifth commandment, honor your parents. Children are specifically admonished to honor your parents. So while fathers are told, do not provoke your children to wrath, the children have a specific command. You know this, father? You have an obligation to honor him. And in general, children are expected to obey parents while living under their authority and support. We talked about that last time as well. And even today, we teach children obedience so long as the parents are responsible for that child, even past the age of 18. And that's something else we talked about last time. A key thing to remember with children is that one's own children, your minor children who are living at home under your care, your kids, not your adult children, your kids, generally cannot leave. They can't just decide, well, I'm not going to live here anymore. I'm leaving and you're never going to see me again. We call that running away. And if we catch someone running away, well, we take them back home. No matter how you treat your child, they're pretty much stuck with you. They're stuck in your home. And unless you yourself make other arrangements, or unless you're at the level of abusiveness that the government's going to take your kids away and not let you have them back, and so your kids have to accept whatever you do, whether they like it or not. Also, the immaturity and emotionality of youth makes young people more prone to be emotional, and thus make them particularly susceptible to some form of being provoked to wrath, even for good things that parents do. And even so, the Bible says, do not provoke your children to wrath. Now, by the way, wrath is different than anger. And so the reason I like to use this translation is, do not provoke your children to anger. Well, children are going to get angry. And in fact, sometimes, depending upon the child, and depending on what the parent's doing, an angry child can sometimes be a better indication that you're on the right track as a parent than having a child who's not angry. If your child wants chocolate cake for breakfast, and you say no, your child might pitch a fit. If you're in a toy store and your kid wants that toy up there on the shelf and you say no, your child might pitch a fit. That doesn't mean you're supposed to feed your child chocolate cake for breakfast and buy your child every toy they point out at the toy store. So it's not just if your child gets angry, you did something wrong. But you're not to provoke your children to wrath. Now, one of the frameworks for wrath to understand is the wrath of God. Because wrath isn't really a word we use all that much. So when there's the wrath of God, that means that God's rules have been broken so far and so consistently that now he is going to impose his rule by force, because non-force methods have not been effective. And so when you're going to provoke your children to wrath, that means now your children's rules have been broken so much that now they're going to impose their rule by force on purpose, because that's the only way they see it happening. And so now they are rebelling against you. Now they're seeking to punish you. They're seeking for there to be a penalty. They're trying to break out from under your control, whether they're doing it covertly, by trying to sneak out and do things and hide it from you and keep their secrets, or whether they're doing it overtly and they're throwing it in your face and they've risen up against you to fight against you to your face. These are wrathful behaviors. And so if you can If you do provoke your children to wrath, now they are assuming authority, and now they're stepping up, and now they're stepping out, and now they're deciding they know better, and they're not listening to you anymore. Now you've lost your effective authority and influence in their lives. Now you're going to have to just resort to that command power, that raw force that you had because you're still the dad. But there's an interesting principle, though, we can gain from this. Do not provoke anyone to wrath. Members of one's own household are the ultimate lawful target for many people's worst behavior. Lawful target means that someone gives themselves permission to make someone the target of their worst behavior. Now, this is different than someone becomes the target of your worst behavior. Specifically, lawful target is when you give yourself permission. Now, how can you tell someone's giving themselves permission? Well, an easy way to tell is when someone has done this, are they apologetic and take steps to fix it, or do they make excuses? An excuse is permission. If I'm late and I tell you, well, I'm late because there was an accident on the highway, and I got stuck in parking lot traffic until we got past the accident. Well, what I'm saying is, because there was this accident on the highway, I should have permission to be late. And going forward, what I'm saying is, whenever I'm on my way here, if there's an accident on the highway and I get stuck behind it, I assume permission to be late. Now, if I just say, well, I'm late because there was traffic, but it's normal and ordinary traffic. What I'm actually telling you is, I'm assuming permission that any time there is normal and ordinary traffic, I give myself permission to be late. And what that's really meaning is, I always have permission to be late because my excuse is the normal and the ordinary. So when everything's a normal and ordinary, I have permission to be late. And so when someone engages in some of their worst behavior, if they make excuses for it, they're telling you, I give myself permission to have this kind of behavior toward you under the circumstances I declare adequate for my excuse. Now, children are the least able to defend themselves. They're the least able to get out of the way. They're the least able to break up with their parents and escape a parent's wrath. They're the least likely to have someplace else that they can go. They'll have someplace they can go, well, you know, Dad's out of control. Dad's provoking me to wrath. I just need a break from Dad. They're the least likely to be able to make that decision without their dad's consent. So how much more important would it be then to not provoke to wrath those who can leave? Those, perhaps, who even should leave for bad behavior. So one of the things we can run into is, say, for instance, if I have a wife, and I also have a job. And say with my wife, I engage in certain behaviors with my wife, and I give myself permission to do that, because, darn it, you know, she's my wife. She has to put up with it. I'm her husband, and she needs to do what I'm telling her. But then I have this job, and suppose I'm in charge of people at my job, but I'm much more patient with them. Because I know, well, if I treat the people at work the way I treat my wife at home, well, you know, I could lose my job. That my boss could fire me, my employees could quit. And so I behave well over there because they'll leave. But I'm going to assume that my wife isn't going to leave. And so therefore I give myself permission to behave badly toward her, when for the exact same things I behave badly toward her, I wouldn't do that to members of my team. I wouldn't do that to people that I manage. I wouldn't do that in front of my boss that could fire me. That when I might pay a price, I'm well behaved. When I think I'm not going to pay a price, because I think, my wife's not going to leave me over this. In fact, you know, she'll feel bad. She'll blame herself. So I can unload on her. But really all I'm doing is saying, well, unless it's in my self-interest to behave myself, I'm not going to bother to behave myself. I declare my wife my lawful target. Well, can a wife leave? Yes. Can a wife go somewhere else? Can an adult decide, you know, I'm not putting up with this stuff. I'm going home to my parents. I'm going to stay with my parents for a week. And, you know, I'm going to go stay at my friends for a week. They can do that. A wife can divorce you. But if you've got a couple of 10-year-olds at home, they can't do that. They can't make that decision on their own. They can only make that decision with the consent of the person they're trying to escape. And so if we know to not provoke to wrath those who cannot escape. If we know we're not supposed to provoke to wrath, those basically have to put up with us. How much more important is it to not provoke to wrath those who can leave, those who can separate from us, those who can fire us, those who can quit from us, those who can end relationships, whatever the type of the relationship is. There's even an obvious self-interest there. And so in the totality of relationships, God shows up and says, these people that cannot escape, your own children in your own household, who are the ultimate recipients of your highest level of authority in your home, do not provoke them to wrath. And if you're not supposed to provoke them to wrath, the ultimate lawful target for some people, how much more obvious is it you don't provoke your spouse to wrath? How much more obvious is it you do not provoke your extended family to wrath? How much more obvious is it you do not provoke your friends to wrath? How much more obvious is it you do not provoke your boss to wrath, your employees to wrath, your co-workers to wrath? And that if you do these things to a child, when they are old enough to leave you, they will minimize their interaction with you. They'll basically try to get out of your home, out of your life as much as they can. They might see you at kind of semi-mandatory family functions, and they will dread seeing you. But when the relationships are even more optional than that, and someone could leave you and leave you now, it is even more important to not provoke them to wrath. And we take it to one of the ultimate business levels. If you provoke bosses to wrath, you lose jobs. If you provoke customers to wrath, you lose customers and you go out of business. If you provoke the customers of your boss to wrath, and so your boss loses customers, you lose a job. And you lose recommendations. You could lose an entire career. And so you need to watch out for these things. And this key thing of do not provoke your children to wrath is a very clear instruction that if you don't even provoke children, the ones who cannot leave, the ones that are most under your authority, obviously you don't do this to people who are less under your authority. Another principle in here is be not provoked to wrath. So this is the counterpoint principle to not provoking someone to wrath. The more loving, mature, and understanding we are, the less normal will provoke us. Now for some people are so easily provoked that just normal provokes them. Normal stuff gets them all riled up. There's nothing unusual in what's going on, but boy, does that get them miffed. Even so, there are those who will push our buttons. And if we know there are people who will push our buttons in adult relationships, we have the option of crafting the relationship. That if you have, say, you have a father who provoked you to wrath, as a member of your family, it's one of your parents, and you know you're going to see them at Thanksgiving, and you know you're going to see them at Christmas, and you know they push your buttons. You might even know that they get some kind of sinister glee out of pushing your buttons, because it makes them feel like, they're still my kid, because see how intense their reaction is to me? That shows how important I am in their life. That I can still get my kid riled up. And there's some people who think this way. I mean, not consciously, but you watch their behavior. The way they know they're important is they can make someone ticked off. And you watch the way they do it. And people, you see the negative impact I can have in the world around me. That shows that I'm important. That shows that I'm powerful. And there's people who do that. And they know what buttons to push on you because they know you that well. And you know that's someone you have, then you can craft your relationship with such a person to minimize their opportunity to do that. And when you know you're going to be in the presence of someone who is going to push your buttons, you can craft a relationship in such a way to minimize their opportunity to push your buttons in that particular event and just even be braced for it. And just know, this is what they're going to do, and you know what? I am just going to ignore them. One adult child, decides, I want to see my parents, but when I'm in their home, they push my buttons. When they're in my home, they push my buttons. But you know what I notice is when we're out in public, when we're at a restaurant, they don't do that. And if they did do that in a restaurant, it's very easy to get up and leave out of the restaurant. And so this adult child decided, well, I'm only going to meet my parents in public places. I'm only going to meet them for lunch or dinner at a restaurant. And then that way I don't kind of get cornered in the house, because they seem to like to wait until I'm involved in something where I can't just get up and leave. And of course, if they're at my house, it's harder to just throw them out. But if we're at a restaurant, that makes it easy. And the restaurant relationship was safe. And so he could spend time with parents and be relationally and emotionally safe, because he knew, okay, my button-pushing parents don't push buttons in public, and crafted the relationship in that way. Now, sometimes you need to leave a relationship. Sometimes you need to leave a relationship completely. Some relationships are so abusive, so persistently negative, you just can't be in it. And that you either completely leave the relationship, you quit the job, you end the friendship, you just don't see those family members at all, or you craft it so you can minimize it if you cannot avoid being provoked by someone. Now, a question in the provocation is it me or is it them? Maybe it's me. Now, if it's them, they need to change their behavior. Now, I may have a limited ability to change anyone else's behavior, in which case whatever I need to do to protect myself from someone might be quite reasonable. But if it's me, I need to change. I need to adjust my own behavior. I need to stop provoking or stop being provoked. So based upon the silver rule, do no harm, it may not much matter right now. In the moment, you just want to avoid doing more harm. And one of the easiest ways to avoid doing more harm is to create distance, to create space. Now, some people get ticked off when you create space, especially controlling people get ticked off when you create space, because if they want you as their lawful target, whether they do it generally or just right now, they think that you're the righteous target, that they're punishing you right now and don't you dare leave on your punishment, then some people will get ticked off because you're leaving. But overall, getting distance is generally going to be your best bet to avoid damage in general. Now, whether it's you or them, you may need to find space right now, but long term, you want to try to answer this question. Is it me or is it them? Am I being too sensitive, or are they behaving badly? Am I being too easily provoked by normal and ordinary things? And I need to grow up. I need to learn to accept that normal is normal, and I should expect normal. Or is it them and they need to change their behavior, and if they don't, I need to recraft this relationship so that this doesn't have to be a persistent part of my life? And this is a question that ultimately we need to answer in any relationship we have consistent problems. Now, to whatever extent it's me, I need to change. If I'm the one doing the provoking, I may need to change if what I'm doing that's being provoking isn't something I ought to be doing. Now, if it says, it's okay, but, I don't really need to be doing it, but for that person, it's a big deal. All right, well, I may want to extinguish that behavior. That I might think the behavior is okay, but if it's a big deal to somebody else, okay, I'll do that for somebody else. But if I think what I'm doing is the right thing, if what's being asked of me I think is ridiculous, then I may need to recraft that relationship. Or if I'm doing provoking of other people, I may need to recraft the relationship just to avoid doing that to other people, unless the reaction I'm getting I honestly think is completely out of control. And even so, well, then why am I in relationship with a person that I think is completely out of control? In fact, one of the curious things sometimes I run into is when you're dealing with some people that get incredibly judgmental, and everybody's bad, that person's insane, they're just crazy. And they're getting on their husband, or they're getting on their wife, or they're getting on their friend, or they're getting on a family member that they spend a lot of time with, and they get enormously judgmental on how mentally ill they are, or how they're always this way. Okay, well, first off, if that's true, why are you going out of your way to stay in a relationship with an insane person? And then on the flip side, why would someone stay in a relationship with someone who thinks they're an insane person? And so it creates a different level of question to be looking at. Like, what is it in this relationship that is worth keeping if you seriously believe this person is completely insane, malicious, evil, stupid, whatever it is you keep accusing them of at an identity level, and yet you're choosing this person as a partner in marriage, a partner in romance, a partner in parenting, a partner in friendship, a partner in business. So why are you choosing this person? And why is this person choosing you to be in a relationship with someone who thinks they're messed up, they're broken, they're damaged, they're insane, they're diagnosably insane? And so it gets to be an interesting thing. So when you're talking about provoking people to wrath, when you're talking about is it me or is it them, sometimes it's both. And sometimes you really need to recraft relationships. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to get divorced, but sometimes you need to recraft a relationship. You don't necessarily need to end the friendship, stop a career, but sometimes you need to craft the relationship. Now, the nurture and admonition of the Lord. We're going to wrap up with this, and it's nice to have something a little bit more positive to wrap up with. The nurture and admonition of the Lord. To nurture means to train, to educate, to cultivate, and to care for. So if you're going to nurture someone, you're going to nurture up a child, you're going to train the child. If you're going to be nurturing a child, you're going to see to that child's education. If you're nurturing a child, you're cultivating responsibility and maturity in that child. You might be training them up in the way that they should go. You're taking care of the child. That's nurturing the child. For self-nurture, that means that I'm taking care of my own training. I'm nurturing myself. I'm helping myself learn what I need to learn, to be better at what I need to be better at, to be training myself. I'm self-educating, which today is easier than ever. There's books to read. There's audios to listen to. There's programs to go through. There's classes to take. There's all kinds of stuff available online. We don't even need to get up and go somewhere to take a seminar anymore. And so we see to our own education. We cultivate ourselves, that we take care of ourselves. And if we take care of ourselves, if we cultivate what's best in us, we cultivate something in the direction that we're trying to go, we get educated in that direction, we get trained for that direction. That's nurturing ourselves, self-nurturing. And of course, obviously, we're talking about doing this for children. Admonition. Now, admonition, when it comes to admonishing someone, it means that you're cautioning them. You're giving them an advisory that if you go this path, there's certain potential consequences here. You advise someone. Now, advising someone isn't necessarily a negative thing. When you're advising someone, it could be, well, yes, that's a good path. This is something else to consider. Or it could be, that's a bad path, this is a good path. I mean, that's the pretty obvious big one. Then it could be, well, that's a bad one. There isn't really a good option, but there's a way to make it less bad. Or there's a way to craft it so that you have more time to figure this out. And sometimes, when you're advising someone, you're advising in best practices. You're advising someone on an upgrade. And then counsel. A lot of times when we talk about counsel, you can talk about counsel like the chief advisors, the counselors for like a king, giving them their opinion, giving them their thoughts on the matter. These days we think of counsel as helping you through situations, helping you through relational things, helping you through your emotions, giving you someone to bounce things off of. Admonish is also to urge to a duty. So when there's something that needs to be done, you're going to urge someone to a duty. And to remind, to reprove, or to scold in a mild and good-willed manner. So if you're yelling and screaming at someone, you're not admonishing them, because there's this mild and good-willed manner. And so it's a nice way of doing things. It's a polite way of doing things. You're admonishing someone not with yelling and screaming. You're admonishing someone with conversation, with teaching, with the training, education, cultivation, and the care of the nurturing. So it's the nurture and the admonition. So you caution your children, you advise your children, you counsel your children, you're a sounding board for them. You urge them to their duties. Is basically you help them be responsible. You remind them of the things of which they need reminders. You reprove or even scold them when necessary, but in a mild and good-willed manner. So, consider this as a general habit, to self-nurture and self-admonish. So the self-admonishment means that I caution myself. I take a look at things and go, okay, Scott, if you keep going down this path, if you keep eating the way you're eating, you're not going to have the physique that's going to be able to do the things you want your physique to be able to do. Or you're not going to have the health that you want to have. So it might be the fit physique, but it just might be having a healthy body too. And you're cautioning me that if you keep going down this path, if you keep engaging in these kind of behaviors, keep engaging in these kind of relationships, if you keep putting these things off, if you keep procrastinating on that project, if you keep putting off, traveling the way you want to travel, if you keep putting things off, eventually you're going to run out of time. If you don't get to some of these things fast, it's warning yourself, it's putting yourself on notice, taking a look at things and saying, okay, is there anything in here that I really need to kind of put on the yellow alert and be aware of and focus my attention on, to self-advise. Now, one of the things that sounds odd sometimes to people to say, well, can you advise yourself? But it's actually pretty stunning sometimes how often we actually do know what to do. But we know what we need to do, we just don't do it. Now, we have this in martial arts too, is that there's almost always this gap between what you've learned and what you consistently do. And once you've been taught something, you can actually drill yourself and continue to work your way forward. So when it comes to advising yourself, sometimes you already know what you should do. Sometimes it doesn't take a whole lot of thought to look at something and go, okay, I know how I need to handle it. Very often, depending how old you are and how much experience you have something that has worked for you in the past, but you just sort of dropped it. Now, maybe you use some sort of particular plan for constant reminders, and you kind of got it. And so you dropped your support, and you were fine. But then later on, you come under more stress. Other things happen. It gets distracting, and those things kind of fall by the wayside. Or sometimes you just drop something you thought just for a little while. It's like, well, right now I just need to not do my workouts because I'm too busy. I got these other things. And like a year goes by, and you realize, if I don't prioritize this, it is never going to happen. And you decide that you got to shuffle some things around. So you can't really honestly advise yourself. Now, counseling yourself can sometimes be a little bit interesting, but you can do that too. With stunning regularity, when you start to speak out loud, when you write stuff down, when you get it out of you, it is amazing how often we get clarity on things. When you find vocabulary to attach to things, when you can actually label something with a word, it is amazing how often it helps us define and understand problems. There's an old story of Abraham Lincoln inviting a friend of his over to the White House during the Civil War. A friend sat silently in a chair while Abe walked around, and he talked out loud the problems that he was having and the challenges he was facing and the difficult decisions he had to make. And then thanked his friend for his help, and his friend left, having never said a word of advice, just sitting there listening. And what had been the power there is just Abraham Lincoln having a chance to speak out loud, to communicate his ideas to another human being, to have to put it into words to get someone else to understand. And he finally had the clarity himself that he could make his own decision. But as part of self-admonition, self-counseling, sometimes we just need to speak it out loud. Sometimes we just need to get it down. And if we write it down and then we look at it later, sometimes we can see things with greater clarity. But also, if admonition includes to counsel, if self-admonition might be self-counseling, self-admonition can also be to seek counsel. That I know I need to be admonished. I need to go find someone who can caution me. Someone who knows more about this kind of stuff so they can tell me where the pitfalls are. Someone who can advise me. But I choose my advisor. I choose my counselor. I choose what I want advice on. I choose what issue I want to be counseled on. Or to urge myself to a duty. Sometimes there's some responsibilities that fall by the wayside. We call that procrastination. and that I need to be urged to a duty, and maybe I need, as part of urging myself to a duty, I may need to go find someone to urge myself to a duty, to do the daily questions, to do a process with me, to help me do the things I need to do. Sometimes I need to remind myself. And actually, reminding myself these days is easier than ever. Because what I'll do sometimes, because I do know that if I have something that's out of the ordinary, and I'm doing other things, I can be easily distracted enough I forget the thing. So what I've done in the most extreme cases of things I know I cannot forget is I will have it in my calendar. I set a notice in my calendar to remind me 5 minutes beforehand, 10 minutes beforehand, 15 minutes beforehand, half an hour, the day before. I mean, I have had as many as 8 notifications coming to text, email, and on my computer to remind me of this thing that I cannot miss, that would be very easy for me to overlook if I get caught up in my work. Now, I don't know how many other people do that, but sometimes I need up to 8 reminders. Some people might need more reminders than that. Some people might never need a reminder. I was just talking to a man and said, I never forget anything in my schedule. But, I do. Sometimes I forget what day it is. Sometimes I missed a mastermind meeting one time because I forgot what week it was. It was the next day when I got to my email and I saw the emails that they were setting up the meeting, because there was an online meeting that week. And I was like, that was this week. I just completely missed it. Why? Because I didn't set any notices in my calendar. And I didn't look at my calendar. And so it just came and it went. It's like, was that yesterday? So I know this about me. So I know, because I know there's certain types of things I forget, I know I need reminders. And so I set my computer to remind me. So we can do self-reminders these days more than ever. And so as we look at nurture, as we look at admonition, as we look at diligence, as we look at promptness, as we look at discipline, all of these things have these powerful self-leadership, wisdom, literature lessons in them. And obviously, we want to use these as parenting. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. And, of course, we have, and you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And as a piece of wisdom literature, we derive wisdom and insight and understanding so that we can use these in our own lives, even when we do not yet have children. And one of the great powers of doing so is then when we do have children, we are already practiced at these principles. This is Scott Connor with QX Church, Parenting and Self-Leadership, lesson number 5. Thank you very much.